The cabin up in Ridgeville had always been a dream. Surrounded by the rustling pines and the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, it felt like a place where time stood still. Emma and I had worked hard to get here. Me pouring years into my logistics company, her carving out a reputation as a sharp, poised professional. On paper, it was the perfect life. People envied us. They'd say things like, "You two are such a power couple." I'd smile and nod, taking the compliments like they were my due. But living it wasn't the same as looking at it from the outside. I noticed the little shifts first, like how Emma started picking fights over things that didn't matter. The kitchen counter wasn't clean enough. The laundry sat in the dryer too long. Once, she snapped at me for not putting my boots away the second I got home. It wasn't like her. I told myself it was just stress. Her job demanded a lot. She'd been putting in extra hours, prepping for some big initiative at work. "Adrian's got us on a tight schedule," she'd say. Adrian. Her boss. The name came up more and more, like a constant hum in the background of our conversations. At first, I thought nothing of it. Everyone has that one coworker they talk about all the time. But the way her voice shifted when she said his name, softer somehow, stuck with me. Then came the late nights. At first, they seemed innocent enough. Big deadlines, she'd say, her hair pulled back and her makeup wiped off as if to sell the image of someone who just slogged through hours of work. But there were inconsistencies. She'd leave the house looking impeccable, tailored dresses, sleek heels, and come home just as put together. Who does that after a 12-hour grind? The clincher was how her excuses started sounding rehearsed. One night, as she was grabbing her coat, I casually asked, "You've been pulling a lot of hours lately. What's the big project?" She froze, just for a second, then plastered on this tight smile. "You wouldn't get it," she said lightly. "Logistics is more your thing. This is creative strategy." She said it like she was explaining calculus to a child. Still, I didn't push. I didn't want to be that husband, the one who's suspicious of everything and everyone. Maybe that's why I tried harder. I started cooking more, cleaning up before she got home, planning little weekend trips to get her out of her work bubble. She'd always nod, thank me, but her mind would still seem miles away. I remember one moment vividly. It was a Sunday morning, crisp and cold, with the sunlight breaking through the pines. I'd made us pancakes, and we sat on the porch sipping coffee. She stared off at the mountains, barely touching her food. "You okay?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. She looked at me, startled, as if she'd forgotten I was there. "Yeah," she said quickly, flashing that same tight smile. "Just thinking about work." The distance was palpable, but I convinced myself it was temporary. We all go through phases in marriage, right? She'd find her way back to me eventually. At least, that's what I told myself. But then, her absences started overlapping with other changes. Her phone was glued to her hand more than ever. The screen always tilted away when I walked by. I caught glimpses of messages, her smile softening in ways it hadn't for me in months. And yet, I said nothing. Maybe I was scared of what I'd find if I dug too deep. The final straw came one evening when I suggested a date night. "Let's go to that little Italian place you like," I offered, thinking it might shake her out of whatever funk she was in. She hesitated, then said, "I'm meeting the team tonight. We're brainstorming over dinner." Her tone was dismissive, like I was asking for too much. I pressed, "Just a little. You've been working so hard lately. Don't you think you deserve a break?" She gave me a look I couldn't quite place. Half pity, half annoyance. "Not now, Peter," she said, grabbing her bag and walking out the door. And just like that, I was left in the cabin, the silence pressing in around me like a weight. Something wasn't right. Deep down, I knew it. But knowing and acting are two very different things. So I sat there, staring at her untouched plate, and told myself that this was just a rough patch. That the woman I'd built my life with wouldn't betray me. But doubts are like splinters. They start small, almost invisible, but dig deeper every time you brush against them. And with Emma, those doubts were starting to bleed. It was late October when everything came to a head. I remember the weather that night as much as the events. Storm clouds rolling in over the mountains, the wind tearing through the trees, and the kind of rain that makes you feel small and exposed. I'd planned to celebrate my birthday that evening. Something simple. Emma knew how much it meant to me. Birthdays in our house were always a big deal. A day to drop everything and just be together. But that evening, Emma wasn't there. At first, I told myself she'd just lost track of time. Work could do that, especially with someone like Adrian pushing deadlines. Still, as the hours ticked by, unease set in. I called her phone, straight to voicemail. Texted her. No response. By 9 p.m., I was pacing in the kitchen, the candles on the small cake I bought starting to look ridiculous. I tried calling again, this time leaving a message. Hey, Em, just checking in. It's getting late. Call me when you can. My voice cracked a little at the end, betraying the knot growing in my chest. Something was wrong. By 11 p.m., that knot had turned into full-blown anxiety. The storm outside was raging, sheets of rain slamming against the windows. I stood there, staring out into the darkness, my mind running through all the worst-case scenarios. Maybe there'd been an accident. Maybe her car had broken down. Or maybe, no, I stopped myself. I wasn't ready to finish that thought. It was just after midnight when my phone buzzed. A single text lit up the screen. Sorry, I'm staying late at work. Don't wait up. The knot in my chest tightened. Something about the message felt off. It wasn't just the timing. It was cold, detached, like she'd sent it out of obligation. I knew Emma. This wasn't her. I didn't sleep much that night. The sound of the rain didn't help, but it was my thoughts that really kept me awake. When she finally walked through the door around 5 a.m., soaked and shivering, I was sitting in the living room waiting for her. Where were you? My voice came out quieter than I intended. It wasn't anger. I didn't have the energy for that yet. It was confusion, mixed with just enough hope that she'd have a good explanation. She froze, clearly caught off guard by my presence. I told you, Peter. Work ran late. It happens. At 5 in the morning? I pressed. Emma, you've never stayed this late before. And what about my birthday? You couldn't even call? Her face tightened, and she dropped her bag by the door. I'm sorry, okay? I didn't mean to miss it. Things just got complicated. Complicated how? I stood up now, crossing the room toward her. Emma, you're not telling me something. She sighed, running a hand through her wet hair. Peter, I don't have the energy for this right now. Can we please just drop it? Her words stung, but what hit me harder was the look in her eyes. Detached, almost dismissive. Like I wasn't worth the effort of an explanation. She brushed past me, heading upstairs to shower. I didn't follow her. Instead, I stayed in the living room, staring at the spot where she'd just been, trying to piece together the fragments of my suspicions. The storm outside had quieted by then, but inside me, it was raging. The next day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I hadn't planned on snooping, I'm not proud of it, but something about Emma's phone had been bugging me. She was always on it, always hiding the screen when I walked into the room. So when she stepped out to take a call on the porch, leaving her phone on the kitchen counter, I made a choice. It only took a few swipes to find what I was looking for. The text thread with Adrian was pinned at the top. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the messages. At first, it was all work-related, the kind of back and forth you'd expect between a boss and employee. But then the tone shifted. Can't wait to see you tonight. I'll make it worth your while. I wish I could spend every night with you. You make me feel alive again. The last message was a photo, a blurry shot of a cabin, dimly lit in the rain. My stomach churned as I realized what I was looking at. I knew that cabin. It was a rental just a few miles up the mountain. My hands clenched around the phone, the weight of the betrayal sinking in like a lead anchor. This wasn't just some office flirtation. This was a full-blown affair, unfolding right under my nose. When Emma came back inside, I was still holding her phone. She froze when she saw it in my hands, her face draining of color. Peter, she started, but I held up a hand to stop her. Don't, I said, my voice low and steady. Don't lie to me. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us thick and suffocating. Then, without another word, she grabbed her phone and walked out the door. The storm that had started outside wasn't over yet. If anything, it was just beginning. After Emma walked out, I just sat there, staring at the door, the sound of it slamming echoing in my ears. My chest felt hollow, but my mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. 4 years, I thought I knew her, but the texts on that phone were from someone I didn't recognize. Someone capable of sneaking around, lying with a straight face, and walking away when confronted. I didn't follow her. I couldn't. Instead, I stayed in the kitchen, staring at the dark reflection in the window as morning crept in. The world outside was waking up, but inside everything felt still. Frozen in the moment where I saw that picture and knew. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was fact. Emma had been with him. Adrian. Later that morning, I tried to go about my day like it was any other. I worked from my home office, pushing through emails and phone calls, but my mind kept wandering back to those messages. The cabin. The way she looked at me when she realized I'd found out. There wasn't even anger in her eyes, just guilt and maybe a little fear. That stung more than anything. Around lunchtime, I finally heard her car pull into the driveway. I braced myself, waiting to see if she'd come inside, if she'd offer some sort of explanation or apology. But the seconds ticked by, and nothing happened. I walked to the window and saw her sitting in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead like she was stuck in some kind of trance. Finally, she stepped out and came inside, setting her bag on the counter like she hadn't just shattered everything between us. I couldn't hold it in anymore. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. She froze, her back to me, then slowly turned around. "Out. Out," I repeated, crossing my arms. "That's the best you can come up with?" Her jaw tightened. "Peter, I don't want to do this right now." "Well, tough," I shot back. "Because I'm doing this." I saw the messages. Emma. The ones from Adrian. For a split second, I thought she might deny it. Her lips parted like she was about to speak, but then she closed them again, looking away. That silence told me everything. "How long?" I asked, the words catching in my throat. "How long has this been going on?" She let out a shaky breath and leaned against the counter, her arms crossed protectively in front of her. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me," I said, taking a step closer. "What is it, Emma? Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty damn clear." Her head snapped up, and for the first time, I saw the crack in her composure. "I didn't plan for this to happen, okay," she said, her voice rising. "I didn't mean for any of it to happen." "Didn't mean for what to happen?" I pressed. "The lying? The sneaking around? Or the nights at a cabin with another man?" Her face crumpled at that, and for a moment, I thought she might actually cry. But instead, she straightened up, her expression hardening. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said quietly. "But I'm not going to stand here and be interrogated like a criminal." "That's rich," I said bitterly. "You betray me, and now you're the victim?" She flinched at my words, but I didn't care. I was too angry to stop. "You don't get to play the innocent party here, Emma. You've been lying to me for who knows how long, and you didn't even have the decency to own up to it when you got caught." "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sorry." I laughed bitterly. "You're sorry? For what? That I found out? Or for what you did?" She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed her bag and walked upstairs, leaving me standing there in the wreckage of our conversation. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in our bed, staring at the ceiling while Emma stayed in the guest room. The storm outside had long since passed, but inside, I felt like I was still in the middle of it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the messages, that cabin, and the look on her face when I confronted her. At some point, I got up and went downstairs, hoping a glass of whiskey might help settle my nerves. As I poured it, I noticed her phone sitting on the counter where she'd left it earlier. For a moment, I considered picking it up again, digging deeper into the messages to see just how far this betrayal went. But then I stopped myself. What good would it do? I already knew enough to break me. Instead, I took the whiskey and sat by the window, watching the moonlight filter through the trees. My mind kept circling back to one thought. How had it come to this? I built my life around Emma, trusted her with everything I had. And now, that foundation was crumbling beneath me. When she came downstairs the next morning, we didn't speak. She made coffee, I made toast, and the silence between us was deafening. I could feel the tension radiating off her, but I didn't have the energy to address it. Not yet. By the time she left for work, I felt like a ghost in my own home, adrift, hollow, and unsure of what came next. The days that followed felt like wading through quicksand. Everything in our house was muted, as if the betrayal had sucked all the life out of it. Emma and I operated like strangers, moving around each other in a way that made the silence unbearable. I tried to bury myself in work, but every time I sat at my desk, my mind wandered back to the texts, the cabin, and the audacity of her betrayal. I didn't want to snoop again, but I couldn't stop myself. That night, I waited until Emma was asleep in the guest room. My heart pounded as I slid her phone off the kitchen counter and unlocked it using the code I knew she hadn't bothered to change. Part of me felt sick, like I was crossing a line, but another part, the angrier, betrayed part, pushed forward. The messages between her and Adrian confirmed everything I feared. There were photos, conversations about their secret meetups, and even inside jokes about me. It was all there, like a slap in the face. The worst was a message from just a few days ago. Adrian, last night was amazing. I love how alive you make me feel. When can we escape again? Her response had been just as damning. Emma, soon. I'll figure something out. Just be patient. I stared at the screen, feeling my pulse roar in my ears. It wasn't just lust or curiosity that had pulled her away. There was something emotional here, something she'd given him that was supposed to be mine. My stomach churned at the thought of her planning her next move while sitting across from me at the dinner table or lying about working late. I put the phone back exactly as I'd found it and retreated to the living room. The next morning, I decided I couldn't let this fester any longer. Emma walked into the kitchen, hair still damp from her shower, and grabbed a mug for her coffee. She looked tired, like the weight of everything was finally hitting her. We need to talk, I said, my voice cutting through the quiet. She froze, the mug halfway to the coffee pot. Peter, not now. I've got a lot on my plate at work. I stood firm, blocking her path. No. We're doing this now. She sighed heavily, setting the mug down. Fine. What do you want to say? I gestured to the table, and we both sat. For a moment, I couldn't find the words. I'd rehearsed this in my head all night, but now that she was in front of me, everything felt raw. How long, Emma? I asked finally, my voice steadier than I felt. She didn't even pretend to not understand. She stared at her hands, her fingers fidgeting with her wedding ring. It started a few months ago, she admitted. Months, I repeated, the word bitter in my mouth. While I was sitting here, planning our anniversary trip, you were with him. I didn't plan for this to happen, Peter, she said, her voice defensive. I didn't wake up one day and decide to. Stop, I interrupted, slamming my hand on the table. She flinched, and I immediately regretted the outburst, but I couldn't keep the anger out of my voice. I don't care about your excuses. I want to know why. Why him? Why now? She looked at me then, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. I don't know, she whispered. I felt stuck. Adrian made me feel alive. Like I wasn't just a wife or an employee or alive. I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. So what am I? The guy who keeps the lights on? Who builds a life for you while you run off to feel alive? She pressed her palms to her forehead, exhaling shakily. It's not like that. Then what's it like, Emma? Help me understand, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you threw away everything we built for some cheap thrill. Her tears finally spilled over, but they didn't move me. Not this time. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. But it did, I said coldly. And now you have to own it. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, her composure cracking further. I'll end it, she said quietly. I'll cut him off. I scoffed, leaning back in my chair. Like you haven't already had 100 chances to do that? Her head snapped up, and there it was again, that flash of guilt. She didn't answer, and I didn't need her to. I'll tell you this, Emma, I said, standing. You've shattered my trust, and I don't know if we can ever get that back. But if you think I'm going to sit here while you make me the fool, you're wrong. Peter, please, she started, but I cut her off. No. Don't ask me for patience or forgiveness right now. I can't give you what I don't have. I stepped toward the door, grabbing my jacket. You wanted to feel alive? Congratulations. You've made both of us feel something. I left before she could say anything else. I didn't have a plan. I just needed air, space, anything to get away from her and the lies she'd spun around our life. I drove aimlessly for hours, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The mountains stretched endlessly before me, but they didn't feel calming like they used to. I pulled over eventually, parking on the shoulder of a desolate road. The storm from the previous night had left the world washed clean, but inside, I felt anything but. I sat there, staring at the horizon, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. I came home after hours of driving, feeling no closer to clarity than when I'd left. The house was dark, save for a dim glow in the kitchen where Emma sat, nursing a cup of tea. She didn't look up as I walked in, and I didn't say anything as I hung up my jacket and grabbed a glass of water. The silence between us felt like a living thing, heavy and suffocating. I called Adrian, she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. I froze mid-sip, the glass clinking against the counter. Slowly, I turned to face her. You what? I called him, she repeated, setting her mug down with trembling hands. I ended it. For good. And I'm supposed to believe that? My tone was harsher than I intended, but I couldn't stop myself. Her gaze darted to the floor, and she twisted the ring on her finger. An old habit she had when she was nervous. You don't have to believe me, she said quietly. I just thought you should know. I let out a bitter laugh, leaning against the counter. What exactly do you want from me, Emma? A pat on the back for doing what you should have done months ago? An award for coming clean after you got caught? Her face crumpled, but I didn't care. Not anymore. Peter, she started, her voice cracking, I know I've hurt you. I know I've broken something between us that I can't fix, but what? I snapped, cutting her off. You think some half-hearted apology is going to erase what you did? Do you even understand the damage you've caused? She blinked rapidly, tears spilling over, but I didn't stop. I built my life around you, Emma. I trusted you. And you threw it all away for a guy who feeds you a few lines and makes you feel alive. Do you know how pathetic that sounds? Her tears came harder now, and she buried her face in her hands. For a moment, I felt a flicker of guilt for being so brutal. But then I remembered the texts, the cabin, the lies, and it was gone. The next day, I tried to act normal. I went to work, answered emails, and had a few meetings, but everything felt hollow. My co-workers noticed, of course. One of them, Sarah, asked if I was feeling all right. You look like you haven't slept in days, she said with concern. I'm fine, I lied, giving her a forced smile. Just a lot on my plate right now. The truth was, I felt like I was living in a fog. My thoughts kept circling back to Emma, to Adrian, to the life I thought we had. Every time I tried to focus, a new question would pop into my head. How many nights had she lied to my face? How many moments had I missed the signs because I trusted her too much to even look? That evening, as I drove home, I decided I couldn't live like this. If Emma was serious about ending things with Adrian, then I needed to know the full truth. Every detail, no matter how ugly. When I walked in, Emma was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket draped over her. She looked up as I entered, her expression cautious. Hi, she said softly. I didn't respond. Instead, I set my bag down and walked over to the couch, standing in front of her. We need to talk. She nodded, sitting up and setting the blanket aside. Okay. I sat down across from her, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees. I want everything, I said. All of it. No more half-truths. No more dodging. If we're going to even attempt to move forward, I need to know exactly what happened. She hesitated, biting her lip. Peter, Don't, I interrupted. Don't tell me you don't want to hurt me. Don't tell me you didn't mean for this to happen. Just tell me the truth. She took a deep breath, her hands twisting together in her lap. It started about 6 months ago, she said finally. Adrian and we got close. At first, it was just talking. About work, about life. about things I didn't even realize I was missing. He listened in a way that made me feel. Don't, I said sharply, holding up a hand. I don't want to hear how he made you feel. Just tell me what happened. She swallowed hard, nodding. It escalated after a work trip. We had dinner, just the two of us, and one thing led to another. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. How many times? She hesitated, and I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to figure out how much to admit. A few, she said finally. A few, I repeated bitterly. How many is a few, Emma? Be specific. 5, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I closed my eyes, the weight of her words hitting me like a punch to the gut. And the cabin? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. That was the last time. I swear. Peter. I ended it after that. I opened my eyes and stared at her, searching for any hint of the woman I thought I knew. But all I saw was someone who had betrayed me in the worst possible way. You ended it, I said slowly, my voice hollow. After I caught you. Not before. Let's be clear on that. She didn't respond, her shoulders shaking as she cried. I stood, the anger and heartbreak swirling in my chest like a storm. I'm sleeping in the guest room tonight, I said flatly. I can't be around you right now. As I walked away, I heard her whisper, I'm sorry, Peter. I'm so sorry. But sorry didn't fix this. Sorry didn't change what she'd done. The days after Emma's confession were a blur. I tried to go about life as usual, but nothing felt the same. The house was heavy with tension. We spoke only when necessary. Short, clipped sentences about groceries, the bills, or schedules. At night, I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling and replaying her words over and over in my head. She'd said 5 times. 5. Each one a knife to the chest. And the cabin. I couldn't get that image out of my mind, the picture Adrian had sent, a trophy of their betrayal. I knew I couldn't live in limbo forever. I needed to make a decision. Either I moved on, or I walked away. But every time I thought about leaving, I pictured our life before all this. Our laughter, our shared plans, the dreams we'd built together. How could she destroy something so solid, so seemingly unshakable? That Saturday, I decided to take a step toward clarity. I called up Greg, my oldest friend. Greg and I had been through thick and thin together since high school, and if anyone could help me sort through the mess in my head, it was him. Peter, he said when he picked up, his voice warm. Long time. What's going on? Can we talk? I asked. I need some advice. He didn't hesitate. Of course. My place or yours? Yours, I said. I couldn't bring myself to sit in that house with all its memories, not now. When I arrived at Greg's place, he had 2 beers waiting on the porch. He handed me one and gestured toward the chairs. All right, he said, sitting down. Spill it. I hesitated, staring at the amber liquid in my bottle. How do you even begin to explain something like this? Emma, she's been cheating on me, I said finally. The words felt foreign in my mouth, like they belonged to someone else's life. Greg's expression darkened, and he set his beer down on the side table. What? I told him everything. The texts, the cabin, the confession. By the time I finished, his jaw was clenched, and his hands were balled into fists. That's insane, he said. Emma? Are you sure? She admitted it, I said, my voice flat. She's been sneaking around with her boss for months. Greg shook his head, disbelief etched on his face. What are you going to do? I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to pack my bags and leave. But another part. I don't know, Greg. It's like I can't let go of the life we built, even though I know it's not the same anymore. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Peter, you don't owe her anything. She made her choice. And honestly, she doesn't deserve you. The words hit me harder than I expected. Deserve. Did Emma deserve the life I'd worked so hard to build for us? The answer felt obvious, but my heart wasn't ready to accept it. That night, I drove home feeling heavier than ever. The conversation with Greg had been helpful in some ways, but it hadn't given me the clarity I'd hoped for. If anything, it had only solidified how torn I was. When I walked into the house, The smell of dinner wafted through the air. Emma was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup on the stove. She looked up as I entered, her expression tentative. "Hi," she said softly. "I made chicken noodle. I thought maybe we could eat together." I hesitated, the idea of sitting down with her after everything making my stomach churn. But something in her eyes stopped me. Was it guilt? Regret? I couldn't tell anymore. "Fine," I said, my voice flat. We ate in near silence, the clinking of spoons against bowls the only sound. After a while, Emma spoke. "I'm seeing a therapist," she said, her voice hesitant. I looked up, surprised. "A therapist?" She nodded, her gaze fixed on her bowl. "I need help, Peter. I need to figure out why I did this, why I risked everything for nothing. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to try to be better." Her words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to believe her, to see this as a step toward fixing what was broken. But another part, the part that still felt the sting of her betrayal, wasn't so sure. "That's good," I said finally. She looked up then, her eyes hopeful. "I want to fix this, Peter. I know it's a long shot, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I finished my soup and stood, taking my bowl to the sink. "We'll see," I said over my shoulder. That night, I lay awake again, Emma's words replaying in my mind. A therapist. A willingness to fix things. Was it enough? Could it ever be enough? I didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear. This was just the beginning of the reckoning. In the weeks that followed, Emma threw herself into her promise to fix things. True to her word, she started seeing a therapist and came home after every session looking emotionally drained but determined. She even left her job at Adrian's firm. "It's a conflict of interest," she'd said when she told me, though we both knew it was about more than that. I tried to keep my distance emotionally. My trust in her was like a glass that had been shattered. It didn't matter how many pieces she picked up, the cracks were still there. Still, her efforts didn't go unnoticed. Little things like making my favorite breakfast, tidying up the guest room where I now slept, or asking about my day, things that once felt routine now carried a weight of sincerity. But every time I started to soften, the memories came rushing back. The texts. The cabin. Adrian's smug face in the photo. It wasn't just the act of betrayal that haunted me. It was the months of lies, the sheer ease with which she'd looked me in the eyes and hidden the truth. One evening, I came home later than usual. Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, a notebook and pen in front of her. She looked up as I walked in, offering a tentative smile. "Hey," she said. "I made some tea. Do you want a cup?" I shook my head, setting my bag down by the door. "No, thanks." She hesitated, then gestured to the chair across from her. "Can we talk?" I sighed, my exhaustion outweighing my resistance. "What now?" She pushed the notebook toward me. "My therapist suggested this. She called it a written confession." I stared at the notebook, its plain cover giving no hint of the turmoil inside. "A confession?" Emma nodded, her hands twisting in her lap. "It's everything, Peter. Every detail of what I did, why I did it, how I felt." She said if we're ever going to rebuild trust, I need to be completely transparent. No more secrets. For a moment, I didn't move. The thought of reading her innermost thoughts about the affair made my stomach churn, but at the same time, wasn't this what I'd been asking for? The full truth? "Why write it down?" I asked, my voice cautious. "Because I freeze up when we talk," she admitted. "I get scared, and I hold back, even when I don't mean to. But this is everything without hesitation." Reluctantly, I reached for the notebook. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," I said honestly. "I know," she said softly. "Read it when you're ready. Or don't. But I wanted you to have it." I took the notebook to the guest room that night, setting it on the nightstand and staring at it like it might burst into flames. Part of me wanted to rip it open and devour every word, to finally understand what had driven her to betray me. But another part was terrified of what I'd find inside. I didn't open it for 3 days. During that time, Emma continued her efforts, cooking, cleaning, asking how I was doing, but she didn't mention the notebook again. It sat on the nightstand, a silent reminder of the chasm between us. Finally, one night, after hours of lying awake, I gave in. I flipped on the lamp, took a deep breath, and opened the cover. The first page was a letter, addressed to me. Peter, before you read this, I need you to know that I hate myself for what I've done. I know that might not matter to you, and I don't expect it to, but it's the truth. This isn't an excuse or a justification. It's an attempt to give you the answers you deserve, even if they're painful. My chest tightened as I read her words. The pages that followed detailed everything. How her feelings for Adrian had developed, the guilt she'd buried every time she came home to me, the moment she'd almost ended the affair but didn't. She didn't sugarcoat anything. The honesty was brutal, and by the time I reached the end, I felt like I'd been dragged through hell all over again. But there was one line that stuck with me, written near the end. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm asking for a chance to earn it. If you'll let me. The next morning, I found Emma in the kitchen, pouring herself a cup of coffee. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes flicking to my face as if searching for a sign of how I'd reacted to the notebook. I read it, I said, my voice hoarse. Her shoulders tensed, but she nodded. Okay. I still don't know where we go from here, I admitted, leaning against the counter. But I appreciate the effort. Her lips trembled, and she set the coffee pot down with shaking hands. I just want a chance, Peter. That's all I'm asking for. I sighed, rubbing a hand over my face. I can't promise anything, Emma. Not yet. I know, she whispered. For the first time in weeks, I felt the smallest flicker of something other than anger or pain. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. The weeks turned into months, and while Emma and I continued to coexist, the shadow of her betrayal lingered like a storm cloud. Therapy seemed to help her. She was calmer, more introspective, and careful about her words. She no longer tried to push me into forgiveness or rush me to move on, which I appreciated. But as much as she worked on herself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed between us. Something that couldn't be repaired. I still slept in the guest room. The bed we used to share felt like a battlefield, and I had no interest in lying in the wreckage. Most nights, I'd fall asleep to the sound of rain on the windows or the faint hum of the fridge, wondering if life would ever feel normal again. One evening, as we sat in the living room watching a movie in near silence, Emma turned to me and said something I wasn't expecting. You deserve better, Peter. I glanced at her, startled. What? She took a deep breath, her hands folded tightly in her lap. You deserve someone who doesn't break your trust. Someone who loves you the way you loved me. And if that's not me anymore, I'll understand. Her words hung in the air, heavy and final. For the first time, I saw how much the affair had cost her too. Not just our marriage but her sense of self-worth. She wasn't the woman who'd arrogantly defended her choices months ago. She was someone who had been broken by her own mistakes. I don't know what I deserve anymore, I said honestly. But I know what I can't live with. Doubt. And that's all I feel now. Every time you walk into the room, every time you say you're going somewhere. I hate that, Emma. I hate what this has turned me into. She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. Then maybe it's time to let go. The next morning, I made the decision I'd been avoiding for months. I asked Emma to sit with me at the kitchen table, the same place we'd had so many difficult conversations. I think we need to separate, I said, my voice steady but firm. Emma's face fell, but she didn't argue. She just nodded, her hands trembling as she reached for her coffee. I don't hate you, I added, surprising myself with the admission. But I can't stay in this house, pretending everything's okay when it's not. I understand, she whispered. I want you to be happy, Peter. Even if it's not with me. It wasn't an easy conversation, and it didn't end with any sense of closure. But it was honest, and for the first time in months, I felt a weight lift from my chest. Over the next few weeks, I moved into a small apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't much, a single bedroom, a creaky kitchen table, and a view of a parking lot, but it was mine. I brought only the essentials. Clothes, a few photos, and my laptop. Everything else stayed at the house with Emma. She and I agreed to keep things civil. We met occasionally to discuss dividing our assets, but the conversations were brief and polite. The warmth we once shared was gone, replaced by a quiet respect for each other's space. One evening, a few months later, as I sat on my balcony sipping a beer, my phone buzzed. It was Emma. "Hi," she said when I answered, her voice tentative. "I just wanted to check in. See how you're doing." "I'm okay," I replied. "How about you?" "I'm adjusting," she said with a small laugh. "It's strange, being in the house without you. But I think it's what I needed. To figure out who I am, without depending on someone else to define me." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "That's good. I hope it helps." There was a long pause, and then she said, "I just want you to know, Peter. I'll always regret what I did. And I'll always be grateful for the time we had, even if it ended the way it did." Her words were bittersweet, but they felt genuine. "Thanks, Emma. I wish you the best. Take care of yourself," she said softly, and then the line went dead. As I sat there, staring out at the fading light, I felt a strange sense of peace. The anger, the bitterness, even the heartbreak, they were still there, but quieter now, like echoes instead of screams. This wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was the life I had. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could move forward.